welcome everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. Paul, do you know what makes doing this show so much fun for me?
I don't.
You don't? Well, you should have caught it by now, because it's all about satiating my unyielding curiosity. Today we are taking yet another walk through Charlie's forest of never-ending curiosities. This time we chat with prolific author Bruce McAllister, who writes science fiction, fantasy, horror and thriller fiction, and even a bit of poetry. Now, as a military kid, Bruce lived in many places where he learned to live the life of what he calls an outsider. He writes, "The theme of the outsider, the other, or the alien is in the larger sense, runs through almost all my fiction. That came from being from a military family and from having a sense of being an outsider." In his bio on Amazon, the writer says that Bruce, I love this, Bruce invites you into a universe where nothing is more important than what it means to be human. We will certainly explore what that means. And so with that, let's bring our guest on the show, Bruce McAllister. Welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks for the invite.
Yes, it's going to be fun. I have so many off-the-wall questions. I love off-the-wall questions, but they will be right in your wheelhouse, so I have no fear. But I was thinking, Bruce, before we get into the subject matter, there's depth that comes from your childhood. Do you think you could briefly describe your youth as a military kid? And how it impacted you?
Yeah, interesting question. My father was basically a marine sciences person in the Navy. He was a naval officer, and he was often executive officer of research laboratories. And at the same time, he really was not a Cold War warrior. He was an inventor, and he was full of wonder as well. Our mother was an underdog championing cultural anthropologist who was pretty clearly part Cherokee or Chickasaw. If you look at her father's pictures, he was called chief in the oil fields of Long Beach, California. And so it was an apolitical family, very definitely underdog championing the other and underdogs in society's sense. I remember thinking, I was in high school, that there were two kinds of military brats. Those who became, because of the experience, more gregarious, and those who became more withdrawn, meaning that you had no choice, one or the other. And I think the pattern was accurate. In my case, I wasn't really bookish. I was a bookish kid to some degree, but basically just loved nature, meaning running through tide pools, and I had a shell collection. I was a shell geek. I had a shell collection of 1,000 seashells, all neatly labeled with their Latin names, and that came about because the family, first of all, was Navy stations. We were on one ocean or another, Florida and San Diego and Italy, and people would contribute, seashells to it. And I played, I was a strange kid, but not obnoxious. I would play with seashells the way other kids would play with soldiers. Now, how would I do that? Well, I knew enough about the seashells. I knew a tremendous amount that the fighting conchs, which could kill a larger conch, would be the guard for the queen conch. I mean, this kind of thing. And I've written a couple of stories about that. So once someone called me a 19th century naturalist when I was a kid, and that was true. I mean, all collections and nature, a little bit like Seba. And so that was what made me happy. It was really, I think I came into this world really with a sense of wonder. And there isn't anything more important than that wonder, and that leads a person to see things very differently. and I'm not saying this judgmentally. It just means that there is wonder, and especially for me in nature, but also with people. And I think some people see that wonder, have that sense of wonder more than others do. That's as far as I'll go. I'm, again, the son of a behavioral scientist, so I tend, and writers in general are not judgmental people. They're very open. They have to be to tell human stories. And just
wait a minute. Now that's surprising. I thought writers, I would never have used that term to define a writer, that they're open. I find writers have opinions, and they are very determined to express those opinions. Is that not correct?
Okay. I should have differentiated. By writers, I meant fiction writers.
Okay. Fiction writers are more open then.
Well, because the rule in writing novels and short stories, which is you have to respect your characters. And that doesn't mean love them in a romantic sense, meaning their idealistic sense. It just means you have to be interested in human beings in order to understand them, because even science fiction, even a best-selling high fantasy novel with unicorns and fairies in it, you still want, if you're the author, want to understand human nature, because anything, even if it's space opera or high fantasy of that kind, it still is from us and for us as readers, our time. And yeah, you're right. I've known quite a few nonfiction writers who were quite opinionated.
Yeah, I think we're inundated with it today.
But psychologists would say that's because they're coming from what's called a deductive essay point, which is you have a thesis and you declare it and then you prove it. It's kind of like the force of persuasive writing, whereas fiction doesn't achieve truths that way.
And I would put the nonfiction writers as they're also scared they're not going to get their way. So
that's an interesting view. And yes, force, as opposed to just the power of being and accepting things. Force does, for me at least, as I see it, come from fear.
We just had a show last week on fear, but I want to explore fear from the view of fiction writer. I think you have a different idea of it. You know what I want to do, Bruce? I am a big fan of sci-fi and fantasy. If I had my druthers, it would probably be fantasy, but I just read a sci-fi book and absolutely loved it. I thought it was one of the best books I've ever read.
Oh, good.
That was one I think I told you about, How You Can Lose the Time War, or something like that, with Al-Modar, and I can't think of... You
might be amused by this. Literary fiction of the traditional kind decades ago, which was called character-driven realistic fiction. Now, if you look at a list of Booker Prize novels nominated and National Book Award, literary fiction now has so many speculative elements in it, meaning it has fantastic elements in it because that's what people want. I mean, I think
because it is literary. It was, for the longest time, it wasn't given the credit of literary. It was, on some other level.
Oh, no.
And now they're realizing, the competency and the skills of the writers of speculative fiction and sci-fi and fantasy, that these are highly skilled authors.
Well, and the irony is that mythic storytelling, fantasy storytelling, all of that existed for God knows how long. Meaning go certainly back to Epic of Gilgamesh, and that the realistic character-driven story, novel or short story, is only 500 years old. So to have put that on a pedestal was a little silly to begin with. And I think that's a way for wonder to be achieved, to be reached.
Tell me, here's my observation, and I've had other sci-fi and fantasy fans concur, and I certainly want your feedback on it. This is my view. In my experience, sci-fi and fantasy contain some of the greatest commentaries on social politics, personal values, observations of the human condition. It's almost more sociological and psychological than the nonfiction that wants to give you the detail. This gives you detail, but they sneak it in. They sneak.
Right.
It's kind of like I view you have an inner core and you have a barrier, and data and facts take you up to your barrier, and they really have to perform well to get you past the barrier to your inner core. Well, story starts at the inner core and then works its way outward. And, it sort of sneaks its way right into the heart of things if you adapt to the characters.
That's because fiction is writing from the inside out. Journalism, for example, is the outside in at best. But that's what you said is very perceptive, because that is indeed what fiction, at least from my point of view, does. And science fiction and fantasy, yes, they may have individual characters in them, but their scope tends to be, at least the behavioral sciences, sociology, geopolitics, all sorts of things. And what people don't realize often is that all the great dystopian novels, 1984, Brave New World, Anthem, We by Zamyatin, they're all science fiction. But they weren't called science fiction because if it was good, it couldn't be science fiction. And
no kidding.
That went on decades. And when I got my graduate degree in creative writing, I'm not going to give you TMI too much information about it at this point anyway, but I had to use a trick to get my science fiction novel approved as my thesis for my Master of Fine Arts degree at a University of California campus. Oh no, meaning genre writing was taboo.
Oh really? Was it? When was that? Can you tell me what years that was?
1969 to 71. So
those are basically the same years I was in college.
Well, you may not have been faced with it, but it was definitely literary fiction was character-driven, realistic fiction. And here is what supports what you just said about fantasy and science fiction. That kind of fiction was always defined, meaning the literary stuff, as the human condition through a portrait of an individual. And you see, that's not what science fiction and fantasy are about, and why science fiction and fantasy, through imagination and thought experiments, can end up being satirical and commenting on a larger issue.
That's a wonderful observation, because it's science fiction certainly deals with the individual. We have the individual, the pains and the joys and the frustrations and all of that of the individual, and the weaknesses of the individual. In fantasy and sci-fi, there typically are strong weaknesses in our heroes that they must overcome. Like we talked about Ursula K. Le Guin's The Wizard of Earthsea, and there were strong personal inner core issues that this wizard had to overcome in order to be proficient at his craft.
Yeah, that's one of the hero patterns, the archetypal hero patterns, which is, anyway, it's built into us. It's wired into us. It is something we do naturally. It's good to bring it to consciousness as a writer, but that's the storytelling that's been there for, we don't know how far back the mythic storytelling was, because it was oral rather than written. We don't have the written, but certainly thousands and thousands of years. And the irony, as I was saying, is that literary fiction today has found that to be relevant to readers, it has to regain that mythic element. I love it. It's just beautiful.
And just finally on this subject, I'm thinking just of one series that is such social commentary, and that's is it the 1950s series, The Foundation series with Harry Seldon? You know which one I'm talking about?
I don't know. I don't think I know that.
Oh, that's where he he created a formula to predict psychosocial behavior 1,000 years in advance.
No, I don't know that. That's fascinating.
Oh,
I kind of read.
I don't know if Asimov wrote it or not. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's coming from. Oh, I see. Yes, I'm vaguely remembering that. I read Asimov a long time ago.
And then, there just are so many things that happen in sci-fi that, these brilliant minds were thinking 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 100, 120 years ago. I mean, just in our contemporary time, that are, I read one of the iRobot series, and it took place on a planet that lived in AI, and he's writing AI in 1953. How could a murder take place in a society that didn't touch each other?
It's amazing. If you look at the 40s and the 50s, what was being written in science fiction not only was prophetic as commentary that way, it was actually, some of it, like Damon Knight's short stories, were like, I don't know how to describe them. They were, 50 years ahead of their time. So some of it was crap. Some old science fiction is pretty creaky, low in characterization, and you go back far enough and it was like, scientific fiction, under Hugo Gernsback. But it kind of grew up and came, a literature was being taken seriously pretty quickly in just a couple of decades. There's an anecdote that you may be interested in. John Campbell, who was the famous editor of Astounding magazine, he ran some stories that were about the atomic bomb before there was an atomic bomb, and you can imagine the government was very interested in those stories.
Amazing.
And so it's exactly what you're talking about. What you're talking about wasn't necessarily a threat to national security, but the men in black appeared at his door and said, "What are these stories based on?" Hey, we're science fiction writers. We're imagining things. So anyway, it's one of the great anecdotes from the field.
You know what I'm really interested in, I'd like to transition to, is your emphasis on the human element in sci-fi fantasy. And I've not read a lot of horror and thriller. It's not that I have anything against it. I've just not read that much of it. But in great fantasy and science fiction, there's a profound human aspect and development in the human, evolution in the human, pains, fears, loves. When you say that, when it was written of you that you invite the reader into a universe where nothing is more important than what it means to be human. I so agree, and yet I really want to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, thank you. Because I don't usually have a chance to say what that means in my case.
Oh, really?
No, I don't think I've ever been asked that about that line. It's kind of a promotional line.
It's a great line.
Science fiction has become more and more human through better and better characterization, meaning as fiction, since Hugo Gernsback, since the beginning. And it started to do that. For example, if you look at even Golden Age of science fiction writers, sometimes, like Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, not great characterization in a literary sense, but good grief, just an amazing story. It's gotten better in terms of characterization. That's one thing. But in my case, what interests me about science fiction ideas is the human response to them. In other words, with a given idea, will we remain human with that science fiction idea, or will we change? Yes, it is important to be human, but with a science fiction vision, what that means can change. I mean, there are a lot of forecasters and science fiction writers who are saying, basically saying what happens when a 16-year-old, and it'll probably be a 16-year-old, gets an memory implant device that augments his or her memory, and then what happens to that same kid if connected by Wi-Fi to the brains of others. At what point do we become not human? And some of the predictions, metaverse kinds of predictions, are just bandied about without any real consideration of what it means to being human. And some people don't care. Some people are I don't mean science fiction writers, I mean some people out there are quite willing to have this change and not be human by the definition we used before. So in my fiction, just to make it answer your question, the final line, what I like doing is kind of insisting on the human and seeing what happens with science fiction ideas. And in some cases, one of the stories in my new collection, the woman who's narrating the story has become something else. She meets basically a spaceship captain who's now a cyborg, who knows if he's human anymore, and goes with him, but not out of any romantic idea that we would subscribe to today. It's almost, here's this person who's more alien than an alien would be, just given that it's far future. And I guess I wrote the story to discover for myself to what degree she is still human 5,000 years into the future.
What does it mean in your idea and your writing? What does it mean to be human? I know that's a huge question, Bruce, and so
son of a cultural anthropologist, you might imagine. My brother and I grew up on Apache holy grounds. I've got pictures of me as a toddler and every possible age after that, and so have kind of an experiential cultural anthropologist point of view of it, and has to do with values, and I don't mean that in the political, sense of values. It has, because that's anthropology, studies values. Our mother studied values. And it's complicated. In other words, we have discrete bodies, we have discrete forms, and we have identities that are made, yes, by brain science, but also by psyche. We have identities that are located in one sense in our discrete bodies. Complicated how I
of course, it's a very complex question.
How I see what it means to be human. But what it means to be human, that's a really interesting question. I've never been asked that before. Thank you, Charlie. It means to have values. Now, again, that's not what it sounds like. It just means to have meaning. I'm very sensitive in my own fiction and the world, Hollywood, about the line between nihilism, where nothing matters, and where something matters. Now, the funny thing is today is that having something matter can be viewed as uncool. It can be viewed as romantic. In the literary sense, it can be viewed as sentimental. I don't believe in nihilism. I believe that things do matter. And so that's part of it as well. And so I tell stories in which things do matter. I know it's a weird thing to say, but when the Los Angeles Times film critic calls the movie Lost in Translation sentimental because the older guy does not act in a predatory manner with the young woman, then we know what's going on, don't we?
Yeah.
Meaning it is sentimental for him to do the right thing.
And I think values are, obviously a very distinct human characteristic, and yet I feel today, and I wonder what's being written on it in the sci-fi fantasy genres, is the lack of values. I have a quote that I got from, a person on the right who's an author and a radio show host, and he wrote this: young people have been told that God is nonsense, their country is essentially evil, their past is deplorable, and their future is bleak. So we wonder, why are so many young people depressed, unhappy, and angry? I can't say that that's exactly true. It depends on which side of the spectrum you fall on. But I think there's a lot of truth to that, not only in religion and God, but in the value of our country. 60 years ago, there was great values in the United States. We're not a country of values any longer.
I misspoke. I shouldn't have said values. I should have said meaning. Because as the son of a cultural anthropologist and a behavioral scientist and someone who taught in university, I like to look behind what's being bandied about. And today, no one will talk about what's actually behind what they're saying. And meaning, see, the attack is basically on meaning at all. And meaning, for example, with PTSD victims, meaning of events, of the trauma itself, of life, of heroic action, of being a survivor. Meaning is everything to therapy for that individual. Just one example.
So are values derived from meaning?
Well, values are a way we achieve meaning.
Okay, vehicles.
I happen to agree with the guy said. Again, I am not a political person. We're living in a time where social media, I look at the responses to some of my published fiction online at a large platform like Tor.com, and I cannot believe people are reading the story to basically, I guess, recognize what they already believe or hate. It's just incredible. Yeah. That's the era we're living in. They're not reading. Maybe they shouldn't have to with commercial fiction. In the old days, it would be you read to go to new places, to understand people, to understand yourself better. That's why you read. That's why you read fiction. And now it's more, does this mirror back to me what I dislike?
Exactly.
No, it's crazy. We're living.
We're so in line on that, and that I say we may be the most informed but ill-informed culture in the history of the United States, because people are looking for information, but they're only looking for information that supports what they already believe. So what good is that? How is that developing your interior life?
As once again, son of a behavioral scientist, I'm very interested in what cultural psychologists say about it. And recent utterance by one expert was, stop trying to compare the United States to other first world countries economically, societally, or in any other way. We have the cultural myths, meaning the stories that we continue to tell ourselves. Not that they're not true, they're stories. That we continue to tell ourselves, and the original stories have dictated everything we see today in America. That's one of the most brilliant things I've seen. And one of those stories is, I have come to this country to get away from prisons, and I want you to leave me alone. I want you to acknowledge me as an individual. And the weird thing is, all the movements we see today are about, as far as I'm concerned, one thing, and that is acknowledgement of the individual, the affirmation of lived life, meaning all of it. It's strange. The pattern, we think they're individual movements, but they're not.
Well, we are tracking, because we're going to take a break right now, and that is precisely the direction that I thought I wanted to take the show, and
oh, good, okay,
and you just gave me a great transition. So we'll take a quick break, and then we will be right back. Hi there, this is Charlie Hedges, and you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie, and my very special guest, Bruce McAllister, is an prolific author who has written science fiction, fantasy, horror, thriller, and a number of other genres, but he's also raised in his mom as a cultural anthropologist, so he has great depth into human drive. As most of you know, I chat with my guest a few days before the show, just so we're kind of tracking together. And during our time, Bruce, you talked to me about the ego and the little self, and that how important those are. And, I'll just give one little quote that you gave me. You told me that because you serve as a writing coach and, you've taught in university for forever in creative writing, and now you're a personal writing coach. Are you still teaching?
No, I'm doing the writing coaching. I occasionally teach workshops.
Oh, okay.
With my client, and also for a local university before COVID was doing that. So I prefer one-on-one. I just really enjoy one-on-one.
And you told me that 30% of your job as a writing coach is to teach students that their little self, or I call them small self, is the problem with their writing.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the ego and the little self, and the problem comes about in dealing with writing. How you will write that out. Tell me your ideas on that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was a great talk we had. I really appreciated that. Let's do it from a writing point of view.
Okay.
Writers who write full time, meaning they just do it as their job. Let's say journalists or writers who do that to make a living often don't have this problem, meaning they either beat it early on, little self, small self, the ego, not in the narcissistic sense, but the little annoying monkey chatter part of us that can create such self-doubt over things and block things. They don't have that. So some writers and best-selling novelists don't. People who don't have it. But in 30 years of coaching, because I work a lot with people who have wanted to write, who want to write and have wanted to write for 20 or 30 years and have had one problem or another with it. And I've never had to write for a living. I'm a university professor. I've done other things. It isn't avocational. I am totally addicted to the short story form and to writing. As I've told people years ago and still do, if I don't write, I don't make my universe, and I tend to get a little crazy. In other words, speaking of meaning. So we have order, beauty. In other words, by writing fiction, I make meaning of the universe for myself. So it isn't, meaning I do it for reasons that may be different from someone who's a professional writer. And I've known, obviously, quite a few.
May I just add real quickly that Joseph Campbell said, we don't find meaning in our life, we bring meaning to life?
Yeah, that's perfect. Yes, exactly. So you can imagine 30 years of writing coaching, people come to me and approach me, and the 30% is 30% of the work I do, just on an average, is a kind of intervention. Now, what's the intervention? Well, the intervention takes two parties, right? Meaning there's the mediator and whatever, and there have to be two of them. Well, it is quite clear to me, and has been for most of my life, partly because of the behavioral science background, psychology background, but what it is the greater self. And again, this is it's not mystical, it's not religious, it's not New Age spiritual. It is a fact. It's a fact. The greater self of the person, and you can call it unconscious, subconscious, higher self, deeper self, deep genius, whatever you want to call it, wants the person to write. They have, and in all cases, for 30 years, there were reasons for the person to write that neither they nor I saw until they got the writing done, and sometimes for a year or two or three later. I mean, it took that much later to see what the other reasons were. Well, their deepest self, we'll just call it deepest self, knew. It knew. Now, is that magic? It's just what we are. Einstein, particle physicists, quantum people, they would go, yeah, sure, exactly right, Bruce. So it's only the rest of society that goes, oh, that's woo-woo, that's New Age. No, it's just, it's the fact.
Well, it's science now. Yeah.
What's getting in the way? What's getting in the way is what evolutionary psychologists say is the human ego. as an embodiment of the body. So try to imagine you have to have a part of your psyche basically watching out for the body. So that part of your psyche...
The physical part of the body.
Yes. Yes. So you have your body, it can die. The ego is basically an emblem of it, embodiment of it, so it thinks it can die. It is, speaking of fear, it is a fearful creature. Everything it does is out of fear, and then defense, needing to control, needing to know. And so it's basically fear, and in Jungian psychology, that's one principle, and the other principle for the rest of the psyche is the eternal yes. There's no fear. And that's, I mean, I'm convinced and have been for decades, and I see it acted out every day of my life with my writing clients. So it goes like this. That 30% of the work I do is basically helping the person take as real what the psyche wants them to do, the deeper self, and to view what the ego, little self, is throwing at them as an illusion. And it often is, but our egos, our little self, small selves, don't want us to see that it's illusion. It wants us to believe it's the truth.
That is so.
Intervention is basically to move from taking seriously as the truth what small self says, and seeing that for the most part it is an illusion. People will say, well, I can't write every day, because that's what writers will tell you to do. You've got to read voraciously, and you need to write every day. That's all writers will tell you, meaning ones that don't want to have to explain stuff. Here's the ego, the small self's talking. Well, I can't. I just don't have the time. I don't have an hour or two in my day to do it. My response, of course, is, what are you talking about? Do you have 10 or 15? Yeah. Well, that's daily writing. Well, but I don't know what to write. Well, then you sit there for 10 or 15 minutes writing, I don't know what to write.
Yes.
And do you think you really can write 15 minutes if I don't know what to write? You'll start to giggle, you'll throw things, and you'll start to write some. In other words, it goes on and on and on, the ridiculous arguments of small self.
Easy to see you're a writer because you're so quotable. There is a line you told me that I really resonated with, and you said, the ego prefers to accept comfortable misery over taking the risk of managing the truth. And I just think we so easily attach ourselves to comfortable misery that it's not that miserable. I'm still okay, but I am not at my best self when I'm accepting comfortable misery. I love this term, comfortable misery.
Well, that's something I really hadn't thought about, which is, yes, if small self gets us to do that, and its fear of taking what it views as risks, which are in the end not risks, that actually limits us, meaning that that's a damper on who we are and destiny and realizing our potential and things like that. That's true. That is a side effect of that. Now, why would it want to do that? Why would it prefer comfortable misery? Because it's scared. It doesn't want us to know that it's afraid of dying, but it is. And all the research is, all the theorists, I'm speaking through my own experience, but obviously come from a background and decades of working with behavioral scientists and other people, and they would agree with this. It is a scared creature. Now, remember a couple of decades ago, there was the inner child.
Right.
Well, the inner child was an inner child that one should be compassionate toward. Well, as we know from films and literature, there are two kinds of children. One is, oh yes, the wonderful girl or boy who rides the dolphin and is telepathically linked, and it's absolutely beautiful, and the other is children of the damned. Right? In other words, there are two children as possible people inside us, and one can be pretty demonic and stubborn. And one of the one of the analogies I use is there's a part of you that's scared and it's getting in the way. It doesn't want you to fly, and it doesn't even know you can fly. And that means writing or anything creative. Because artists have a problem with small self. So I said, walk with it to the edge of the cliff, speak gently but firmly to it, and it may get pretty demonic. It may scream, I hate you. It may do all of those children of the damn things, but still hold its hand and jump off the cliff. It will discover that you both can fly, which is what it doesn't believe will happen.
Yeah. This is uncanny. You are following my notes ahead of me.
Good.
You know my next question was, can we talk about the implications of death? And you had just brought that up. Now, we're not so much talking about physical death as we're talking about the death of the self, either the, I like to call it the true self, but that's, that comes from the Christian mystics, that is the self that is unencumbered by all of the small self and the ego that gets in there. There are so many deaths that must occur. Jesus talks about if you want to gain, you have to lose, and to live, you have to die to yourself. And there is that dying to the ego that, I think that's a wonderful philosophy, whether you're religious or not. That's a wonderful philosophy that you must die to that self in order to thrive.
Yeah. You don't have to, it's not religious, it's something beyond, because religion tends to mean, like atheists know this, it tends, if they're atheists, often an atheist will be anti-organized religion, denominational religion, the portrait of a god a certain way. And this is more like, and we talked about this, Albert Einstein's essay on cosmic religious feeling, and he didn't mean an organized religion with the word religious. He meant a spirituality, a belief in something beyond, because scientists, he said you can't be a scientist without, even no matter how empirical you are, without concluding that there is something always, there will always be something beyond what you know. Well, there's a faith. That's a faith in something beyond, which is the kind of, I think, the spirituality we're talking about.
Undefined.
And so in one sense, it is closer to mysticism than it is to denominational religion. And what was I going to say? Death, what you just quote, you gave, the expression you gave, is not, it means the same thing as the one that I just love. And I think it's from the Bhagavad Gita, but I'm not sure, which is one must die back into life.
Yes.
Now that also parallels Jungian individuation theory, which is
it does.
We go through individuation moments in our lives, and we basically are dying so that we can move forward. Well, why would we need to die? Well, we would need to die non-literally only if we had a small self that had constructed something for us as a self that wasn't the whole truth, right? So the small self, again, discrete body, the cosmology of the individual, all of that stuff. And there's a wonderful line, which is neuroses, as long as they're utilitarian, in other words, work for us, are fine. But the day they stop working, and you can, I've known people where that happened.
Yeah, and you feel terrible. Yeah,
I can't stand this anymore. I got to give this up, and they will basically die back into life.
I want to say succinctly, because it's a very deep question, and it's probably unfair to say succinctly. How do people identify this little self opposed to the self that they can be, the beauty of the self created?
Well, okay, in writing, it's pretty simple, actually. It doesn't mean it's not going to kick and scream, and it is simply, you wouldn't be contacting me unless your greater self wanted you to write. So what's getting in the way for the past 20 years or this year? What's getting in the way? Then I get to hear what's getting in the way. there is a line, like writing is what we do when life doesn't intrude, and that's true. I have a client who is a hospice nurse, and her main patient is in the process of dying. Well, she's not going to write. She was feeling that she was bad because she couldn't write. I said, no, this is life. Writing is what we do when life doesn't intrude. Let's see, what else was I going to say? Hit me again.
Well, there's got to be in there, as what I'm hearing you say is there's got to be some sort of implication that something is not right within myself, and that
we talked about this when we talked. I think what I said was no client, fundamentalist, well, I don't know if they're fundamentalists, but certainly Christian client and clients of other religions, meaning they're religious people, they're people of overt faith.
Sure.
All the way through atheists have no problem talking about, with me, small self, little self, ego, and the greater self. In other words, they have experienced it. They experience it daily. And if I say the following, it seems to help, which is, if it feels like fear, it's small self. And if it feels like joy and inspiration and wonder, it's probably your greater self. And just
is there a place for fear, though? I mean, if
No, that's true. In other words, if someone, it's kind of like texting. If you're writing in a notebook as you cross a street, a little bit of fear is a good idea. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the small self as fear-based.
Right,
if it's afraid, and people seem to be able to understand this, to feel it inside themselves. It's like, that is the voice of fear. The doubt is coming from something. The anxiety, the distraction, it is afraid of not being attended to. The fact seems to be that the small self does not want us to write, meaning some people. And it doesn't want us to write probably because it feels like it's going to die. And as that happens, when you're writing creatively, I mean fiction and everything else, it isn't necessary, is it? Small self is not necessary. And I think that it doesn't like that feeling. And the other could be that the small self needs to have order, creates a cosmology out of things being ordered and known, fear of the unknown, all of that kind of legitimate stuff. And anything new, comfortable misery, threatens it. Well, it's still threatened, meaning it's still fear-based. So the fear is what drives it. People seem to recognize that within themselves almost immediately. But that is because they are in this inner conflict of greater self and small self. Now, if someone's really having a hard time with small self, I do my best Jack Nicholson. Not going to do it here, but I'll say, all right, what do you want on your deathbed? Which regret? That you wrote or you didn't write? Yeah. And that usually they can use to get the small self to shut up. Okay, all right.
So let's sort of wrap up our time together. And what I would like to have, and I'm hitting you unprepared on this. I didn't, this is something you probably would have wanted to think through. Do you have 2 or 3 or 4 steps that can help people deal with this, with these lies and misconceptions of the little self, and how they can sort of die to that and be reincarnated into a truer self? I don't think reincarnated is the right word, but transformed into a better self.
Yeah. Actually, I do. Generally for people, it would be to see mindfulness. We're in a mindfulness movement or moment where we are supposed to be mindful. For people generally, it would be mindfulness. In other words, stopping when something sounds fear-based, negative, self-doubting, and stopping. Mindfulness is what that means. Stopping and looking at it and trying to identify it as indeed small self talking. So that's just a general mindfulness trick for most people. In writing, writing, probably the most successful trick to outmaneuver small self is to write daily, and it does not matter what you write. Write anything, but your existential spiritual contract is with yourself and the universe that you must write 10 to 15 minutes a day. No argument. What happens is that gets that contract, that commitment to the contract, the writing something. It's hard to explain. It would take a while to explain how many monkey chatter objections that gets rid of from small self. And then what happens is the daily writing habit is important because it becomes a positive addiction that will over time get the small self to settle down and stop interfering.
Okay, I'm going to ask for your coaching, and this will be my final question. I'm a writer. I've published books from the past, but I haven't written for a couple of decades. Not books, but I journal daily. I blog weekly for probably 6 years now. And I had a book. I know what I wanted to write my book on. It had to do with Christian mysticism, but I lost it in the midst of reading more. I lost it. How do I regain? And this book is, I think it's very important. I think it's an important book, and I don't know who will read it, but I feel it's an important book to write, and I'll worry about who will read it later.
Do you mean, Charlie, that you lost it inside yourself, or you actually lost the manuscript?
No, I lost it inside myself.
Okay, it is still in you. And one of there are a couple of theories about dreams. One is that there's a dream cartography, a whole world where if you go over the hill, there will be the location of another dream you had. Same thing applies to what's in you in terms of writing. It's still in you, but you have to enact it, obviously, on this mortal plane. And so the best way to retrieve it, it's still there. And it seems like I know why you feel you lost it. That's, a common feeling, and I've done that too. You simply make an outline saying where you want to start and where you want to go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and see what happens. So it's basically journey of 1,000 miles.
Just do the basics. Do what I know what I'm supposed to do.
Do the basics. And because this is the interest, I've done a lot of consulting with dissertation writers and scholarly and scientific book writers over the decades. It's just one of those things, I don't know, I'm just good at it. And so regardless of the field, I seem to be able to do it. One of the problems is the more sophisticated, and that would describe your book, the more complicated and sophisticated or ethereal or abstract or whatever, let's say comparable to a book on philosophy that remains for 400 pages abstraction.
Except my book is 125 pages. I refuse to write a book longer than that.
Oh, okay. What it is what's in your brain feels like something you can't execute in a normal structure. You see, if it were, in other words, if it were simpler, like 8 steps to happiness in the workplace, oh, well, then you just go do it. So it becomes particularly important to just say, I've got to start the journey of it, because the book is how you manage what's inside you, all that stuff.
Oh, this is getting so personal, and yet I feel like I want to ask questions. That I went to Portugal and I wrote quite a bit on the book. I feel like I need to destroy everything I wrote and start all over again, because I think I get into it. But don't view that as a failure. There's a rule that experienced writers have: never throw anything away, never be embarrassed by anything you have written, because it is how you got to this place. And also, the stuff that you feel fails was simply your attempt to take what is true and ever living inside you and put it on the page, on this mortal plane. I mean, it's fine. It's all fine. I wrote a really bad Robert Ludlum imitation novel and thought it was a complete failure, which it was as a Robert Ludlum novel. I'm not Robert Ludlum. But there were maybe 20 pages that were me in it, and then there was this strange page
of a first-person Army nurse in Vietnam. The 20 pages became a story that appeared in Omni, and that one page of the Army nurse became a 120,000-word novel, her whole story.
No kidding. You've given me advice and help, and I think you've informed our listeners, because I know we have writers. There's so many people that want to write, and they have so much fear of writing. I'm not capable. I'm not a writer. I don't have the time. Blah 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 blah. And I think you've encouraged us to understand that some of the roadblocks are untrue roadblocks that come from that small self, come with fear of you know that we're not going to be as grandiose as we might like to be, but we're going to get to do what we want to do. I think you've been very encouraging. Bruce McAllister, this has been a very fun show.
Pleasure, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Which of your books do you want me to put on my website? Is it the Chasing God?
New short story. Yeah, exactly. That it's got a pretty wide range of things in it, and it's my best short stories. And as I said, I'm a short story addict writer.
Okay.
My best stories from the new millennium. So yeah, that would be great if you could do that.
I will absolutely do that. Bruce McAllister, thank you once again for spending the time with me. It's been a delightful chat.
Well, been my pleasure too. Thanks, Charlie.
Okay. And I want to thank all our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. Until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.